Hello viewers, Ford DIYers here back with a tutorial video for everyone. Now in this particular video here I'll be doing a demonstration on how to restore your headlights using the clear coat method way. Now based on the two other previous methods I've shown in the past, this is intended to be a long-term method which you don't have to revisit again. Now the headlight which I'll be using for this procedure here is from my 1997 BMW 540i. Now you don't normally have to remove the headlight from the vehicle itself, but it does make things a lot easier. As you can see here, I've actually split the lens assembly down directly from the whole headlight assembly, just because I had to do a little bit of work with the rest of the assembly. Normally when you do remove the headlight from the rest of the vehicle, it does make it a lot easier because you don't have to worry about overspray or taping off the vehicle, and you can continue just to work on this single part itself. First, what I started by doing is actually wash the headlight assembly itself. Now this is a good method to do because you don't have to worry about any contaminants getting into the wet sanding process and then end up causing any damage to the lens itself. Now what the materials I need for this job here is I'm using a rubber pad. Now you don't normally need one of these, but if you just want to be extra cautious just when wet sanding it, because you can actually push your fingers into the surface that you are wet sanding, which can cause somewhat of a distortion. You will need just some water with soap added to it just for the lubrication process when wet sanding. And considering this headlight isn't too severe, I will be starting out with 1000 grit sandpaper and finishing off with that as well. Now if you do find your headlight is a little more severe, you can start out with 800 grit sandpaper. Now when wet sanding the headlight, you will notice somewhat of a milky substance coming off the assembly itself. That's perfectly normal. What that is just basically the outside coating on the lens itself just slowly sanding away. And you want to make sure when you are wet sanding to always keep this surface well lubricated. It does help prevent the sandpaper from plugging up, as well as preventing any material building up on the lens itself, which could kind of affect the wet sanding process. Now if you are leaving it in the vehicle, you can go ahead and tape off the areas around the hood and the fenders or the bumpers and such, just to ensure that you don't scratch it up with the sandpaper. With this one here I won't worry about too much, but if you are worried about when you remove the headlight assembly from the vehicle, you can go ahead and tape up some of the rubbers here. I'm just being extra careful here, and not to mention here I also do have to pull back the rubbers, so you can see, because the lens does go around on the inside there, and I want to make sure that I do re-clear those portions as well. And as you can see here, I finished up a majority of the headlight lens with the 1000 grit wet sanding here. You can see now it does have a fairly even haze throughout the whole lens itself. Now if we go back over to here, I haven't wet sanded the parking light portion of the lens yet, but you can see there's somewhat of a clouding effect here. Now what this clouding effect is basically the old protective coating which was on the lens itself originally. And you want to make sure you do remove a majority of that. You will find throughout the wet sanding process you'll see somewhat of a cloudy or hazing effects in the lens itself. You'll see a difference in between. Now what you would want to do is remove that, because what happens in the final product, you will sometimes notice an outline on this after, so we want to make sure we eliminate as many of the imperfections as possible in the lens. And just moving on to a portion right here, we can see we did have a stone chip originally here. Now with the wet sanding process, what can happen with the stone chip is it does put an indentation in the lens and does create somewhat of a crater on the outside of it. Now with the wet sanding, this actually does remove the high spots, so we'll make some of the stone chips seem a lot smaller than they actually were previously. Now once you've done wet sanding the surface and you are satisfied with the final product, you can then move on to the next stage here. Now as for the wet sanding, as I mentioned a minute ago, now you do have to remove any of the previous protective coating that was on there. You will notice it does somewhat have a cloudy effect to it, and does have a difference in transition between the actual bare plastic and the coating itself, so you want to make sure that is removed. If you do leave that on in some spots, sometimes what can happen is there can be somewhat of a clouding effect or some kind of imperfections in the surface, so you want to make sure you remove any of that chance as much as possible. And as you can see here, I've already taped off the item as well. I taped off the areas that I didn't want any clear coat on, so you can do as to what you feel it is necessary for your headlight itself. As I mentioned before as well, you can remove it from the vehicle or you can leave it on the vehicle. If you are leaving it on the vehicle, you want to make sure that a fair amount of area is taped off in the vehicle, so you don't have to worry about any overspray on the paint, because at times that can be very hard to clean off the vehicle. Now as for wiping the area down, what I've done is I wiped it down with just regular rubbing alcohol. Rubbing alcohol works great because it evaporates very fast, it doesn't leave any residue on the surface, and it cleans off any oil, bugs, or whatever there is left on the surface. And you want to make sure you do wipe it off at the very end, just before you are ready to paint it, because what can happen even just from handling it, any of the oil that is in your skin can just stick to the surface, and it can cause some some imperfections in the surface, such as fisheye or anything like that. Now the two products I am using here are both by Duplicolor. Now the one here first being is an Adhesion Promoter. Now this is a clear Adhesion Promoter, so you don't have any issues when applying a clear coat. When we're finishing up a 1000 grit sandpaper, that is considered as being very fine, so we want to make sure that the lacquer does stick to that, so this is why we are using an Adhesion Promoter. And the other reason being is that we are painting a plastic surface as well. Now as for the clear coat here, I'm used to using an acrylic and lacquer. Now when applying the Adhesion Promoter, you want to put it on the surface nice and evenly. If there's somewhat of a haze to it, don't worry about it because the clear coat will clean that up. And when applying the clear coat after you've applied this, you want to apply it no longer than 10 minutes after. Normally I would say probably about 5 minutes is the best amount of time. That being is because the Adhesion Promoter is already somewhat dried and it doesn't achieve the maximum adhesion that you want to when applying the lacquer afterwards. As you can see, after this Adhesion Promoter has set up for a minute here, you can see there's somewhat of a haze to light itself. Now that's perfectly fine. Now if you are noticing some watermarks here, that's actually nothing to do with the lens on the outside surface, it's just the inside surface. When I was just wet sanding, some of the water just splashed on the inside, so I will clean it afterwards when I reassemble the whole headlight assembly. Now when applying the acrylic lacquer, you want to make sure there's nice and even coats, no imperfections in the surface such as runs or anything like that, or any drips. Now there's two ways we can go about this. We can either go to the final step here, just applying the clear coat and making sure there's a nice job. If you are fairly good and experienced with a rattle can, you can apply it so you don't actually have to wet sand it after. Now the other method with wet sanding, now you want to make sure you do have enough material on there so when you are wet sanding the surface, you don't actually go down to the lens itself again. Now with wet sanding process, you want to apply, I would recommend 3 coats, or if you're good with the rattle can, you can just do it with 2 coats, and then that second coat there is just your final coat. So you want to make sure whatever your finished coat is does have the nicest of chiefs shine, so that leaves less work for after, has a nicer final product. Now when using the clear coat, normally what I recommend is going all the way around the edges here on the outside and then finish up the main headlight surface at the end. That ensures there is no overspray on that main headlight surface, and if there's overspray on the sides, it's something that is not as noticeable. So once you let the clear coat dry for about an hour, you then can go ahead and remove the masking tape if you put any on there, or off the vehicle itself. Normally you want to remove the masking tape about an hour afterwards. One reason being that if you are sitting in the sun for some time, that painter's tape can leave the glue residue on whatever you taped off. So in this situation here would have been around the headlight assembly itself or on the rubbers, or if you've done it on a vehicle, it can leave it on the vehicle's paint, and this can be hard to clean afterwards. Another reason why you also want to remove it is what happens after a while is if you do have transitions between where you've taped off, what can happen is that paint can actually harden both on the tape itself and on the object, and once you go to remove that tape, you can risk the chance of peeling off the object. Now you can see here I won't be putting it back together today because I want it to sit for a full day until it fully hardens, and then I might do just a quick polishing process over it and just show you what the outcome is after. But you can see actually right here, when I zoom up a little closer, you can see looks like brand new. Now I forgot to also mention when I was taping it off earlier, if your headlight is equipped with these rubbers that go around the outside, sometimes what you can do when you're taping the headlight off, you can put a little bit of pressure on the rubber itself here so it does pull back. So you see we do have somewhat of a gap there until the lens goes back all the way. And what that does there just creates a nice fade line so you don't actually have any hard edges, and it's a little easier to notice once you have a finished product. And with this method here, you actually don't see the headlights have been re-cleared. Just to give you a better look here, when I do have the headlight assembly off the ground, you can see when you go to the closer objects and behind the lens, such as the bezel there, it doesn't show that much of a distortion, but when you look further away, you can see a little bit of a distortion. Now this is what I was talking about earlier. Now even if you are a good painter, there will always be a certain amount of distortion with spray balm. It doesn't put a full-on glass finish. And just to show you from the opposite direction here, you can see in the inside there. So what I'll be doing with this lens is I will be wet sanding it, mainly because I'm actually fairly picky with this too, and I want this to look as best as it can on the car as well. But even just to put it back on the car the way it sits right now would look almost perfect. Now if you did go the wet sanding route, you should be left with a final product that looks like this. Even when you are very good with spray balm, there will always be a certain amount of orange peel, and what the wet sanding does is remove any of that orange peel, and you can see it is a lot clearer when looking through the lens itself here. Now as for the wet sanding, what I basically did is, because it wasn't too severe, there was only just minor orange peel in the surface, I just went with 2000 grit sandpaper, then moved on to a polishing compound, then a scratch remover, and then finally finished up with a wax. Now as for a tutorial on how to wet sand, I will be including that in the description below. So once I've finished and reassembled the headlight together, this is what the final product looks like after the full wet sanding, and I have cleaned the inside of the lens as well. You can see the headlight does look as good as it would come from the factory. Now, as I mentioned before, this is a long-term repair, and this by far achieves the best results compared to the other two methods I've done as well, which would be the toothpaste polishing and the wet sanding and finish up with polishing afterwards. Now if you want to check out those tutorials, I will leave the link in the description below. Now just before my final sign off here, I'd just like to make one more note, which I usually forget to mention in all my other videos as well. I do have a Facebook page, so if you want to go check that out, you can either find it by the link below in the description, or you can just go search it on Facebook as well. It's for DIYers, and usually what I have there is just any photos from current projects or past projects, or even some projects that are currently in progress as well, and I do have some more information of products I've used in the past. So that concludes the rest of my tutorial video. Thank you for watching. If you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to post them below. Also, please subscribe to my channel and like my video. Thank you.